The emergency department was already overflowing when the lights flickered for less than a second. Most people ignored it. The woman restocking trauma supplies did not. She quietly looked toward the ambulance entrance, then at the security cameras, as if something invisible had already changed. Around her, exhausted doctors rushed between patients. A senior physician brushed past her without a glance. A frustrated paramedic muttered, "Just stay out of the way, nurse." Then the first ambulance arrived. Then the second. Then 6 more. Within minutes, the hospital became the center of the largest mass casualty incident the city had seen in decades. As panic spread through every hallway, the quiet nurse began giving calm, precise instructions that nobody understood, until people in military uniforms entered the hospital, stopped in front of her, and waited for her orders. Everyone had mistaken her for an ordinary nurse. Before the night was over, they would discover how wrong they had been. The emergency department never truly became quiet. Even in its calmest moments, someone was calling for a chart, a monitor was sounding somewhere in the distance, or ambulance radios crackled with updates from the streets outside. On that Tuesday evening, the rhythm felt familiar, controlled, predictable. Emily Carter arrived 15 minutes before her shift began, just as she always did. She placed her lunch in the staff refrigerator, changed into clean navy blue scrubs, tied her dark hair into a neat bun, and clipped her identification badge to her pocket. Nothing about her appearance stood out. She wore no jewelry except a plain watch with a scratched metal band. Her shoes were worn from years of long shifts, carefully cleaned but never replaced until necessary. Without saying much, she walked through the trauma bays. She checked every oxygen cylinder by hand instead of trusting the labels. She tested the suction units herself. She counted emergency medications without looking at the inventory sheet. When she finished, every supply cart was arranged with quiet precision. No one noticed. At the nurse's station, conversations revolved around weekend plans and schedule changes. "I heard tonight should be slow," one nurse said while stirring coffee. "We deserve one easy shift," another replied with a tired smile. Emily listened without joining the conversation. She reviewed the patient board instead. Room 7 needed blood work repeated. Room 12 had been waiting for imaging results longer than expected. An elderly man in observation was becoming increasingly restless despite normal vital signs. She memorized every room assignment in less than a minute before walking toward her first patient. "Morning, Mr. Benson," she said gently. "It feels like evening." The elderly man answered with a weak laugh. Emily smiled. "It does in here." She adjusted his blanket, noticed the intravenous tubing had begun to kink beneath the bed rail, and corrected it without interrupting their conversation. She lowered the room lights slightly because the patient kept squinting toward the ceiling fixtures. Small details, tiny comforts. Most people never noticed them. Mr. Benson did. "You're always paying attention," he said quietly. Emily only nodded. "It's part of the job." Across the hallway, a monitor suddenly sounded. Another nurse hurried inside the room. Emily glanced toward the alarm for barely a second before continuing her rounds. "False oxygen sensor," she murmured. The nurse returned moments later. "Loose cable," she admitted. Emily had already moved on. The emergency department grew busier as sunset approached. Stretchers filled the hallways. Paramedics rolled in another patient complaining of chest pain. A child cried while waiting for stitches. Phones rang almost continuously. Dr. Daniel Harris entered the department carrying a stack of charts under one arm. He was respected, experienced, and known for moving quickly. "Emily," he said while passing her, "could you restock Trauma Bay 3 when you get a chance? It was completed 20 minutes ago." He paused. "Oh." Without checking, he continued walking. He never questioned how she always seemed to finish tasks before anyone asked. Near the ambulance entrance, 2 younger nurses struggled to move a portable ventilator into storage. Emily quietly stepped beside them. "Lift from this side," she said calmly. One of them shook her head. "We've got it." Emily stepped back immediately. Neither argued nor insisted. 30 seconds later, one wheel jammed against the doorframe. The machine tilted. Emily caught its weight before it struck the floor. She steadied it with both hands. "Turn the rear wheels first." This time they listened. The ventilator rolled through smoothly. "Thanks," one nurse said, slightly embarrassed. Emily gave a polite smile. "No problem." She returned to her work before either could say anything else. At 6:15 p.m., the emergency department briefly settled into something resembling order. Patients had been assigned. Charts were updated. Fresh linens had arrived. Emily stood beside the central supply cabinet checking expiration dates on trauma dressings. Most nurses scanned the labels. Emily read every package. One expired in 3 weeks. She replaced it. Another had a damaged seal almost too small to notice. She removed it. A nursing student watched from nearby. Do you really check every single one? Emily looked up. If someone needs it, it has to work. The student nodded slowly. I never thought about it that way. Emily simply returned the unopened package to the inspection bin. Outside, rain began tapping softly against the emergency department windows. Inside, the familiar rhythm continued. Wheelchairs crossed polished floors. Lab technicians carried sealed samples toward elevators. Visitors waited anxiously beside automatic doors. Everything appeared ordinary. Emily finished documenting a patient's medication history before glancing almost absent-mindedly toward the large windows overlooking the ambulance bay. She remained perfectly still for several seconds. The rain had changed direction. The wind had shifted. One ambulance that normally would have already returned to service remained parked longer than expected. Another radio transmission echoed faintly through the receiving entrance before cutting off abruptly. No one else seemed to notice. A passing nurse tapped Emily lightly on the shoulder. You look like you're expecting something. Emily's eyes remained on the ambulance entrance for another brief moment. Then she looked away. I hope I'm wrong, she answered quietly. The nurse smiled, assuming she meant another busy evening. So do I. Emily picked up another patient chart and walked calmly toward the next room. Behind her, the ambulance radio crackled once more. This time, she listened a little longer. She said nothing, but somewhere deep beneath years of disciplined training, an old instinct had quietly begun to wake. The clock above the nurse's station read 6:42 p.m. The emergency department had settled into its familiar evening rhythm again. New patients continued to arrive, but nothing suggested the night would become anything unusual. Doctors moved between treatment rooms. Nurses updated medication charts. The waiting room remained crowded, but manageable. Emily Carter continued her rounds without haste. She checked medication orders, reassured anxious families, and helped a young father calm his frightened daughter before she received stitches. Her voice never rose above a quiet, steady tone. To everyone around her, she looked exactly as she always did. Calm, patient, ordinary. But her attention kept returning to the ambulance entrance. A radio transmission echoed faintly from the communications desk. Unit 12 delayed. Static interrupted the message. Holding additional resources. The dispatcher repeated the call before the signal disappeared. Most of the staff ignored it. Delays happened every day. Emily slowed her steps for only a moment before continuing toward the trauma supply room. Inside, she opened a cabinet and quietly counted sealed chest tube kits. 8. Normally, that would be more than enough. She signed out 4 additional kits from storage and placed them in Trauma Bay 1. No announcement. No explanation. Just preparation. As she wheeled the supply cart down the hallway, Dr. Daniel Harris noticed the extra equipment. You planning for a disaster? He asked with a tired smile. Emily kept arranging the supplies. I'd rather move them now than need them later. He shrugged. I admire your optimism. She looked at him briefly. It isn't optimism. Before he could ask what she meant, another physician called him into an examination room. The conversation ended there. At 7:05 p.m., a paramedic entered through the ambulance doors carrying paperwork instead of a patient. He looked unusually tense. Emily recognized him immediately. Marcus Reed had worked emergency transport for nearly 15 years. He rarely appeared unsettled. Busy evening? Emily asked while helping him organize transfer documents. Marcus hesitated. Strange evening. She waited. He lowered his voice. Dispatch has been unusually quiet. Emily looked at him. Quiet. He nodded. Almost too quiet. She understood exactly what he meant. When emergency radio traffic suddenly became sparse, it sometimes meant communication channels were becoming overloaded elsewhere, or units were being redirected before hospitals were informed. Neither possibility was comforting. Marcus sighed. Probably nothing. Maybe, Emily answered. Neither of them sounded convinced. The charge nurse walked past carrying a clipboard. Emily, could you check if Central Supply has more trauma blankets? We are running low. I'll handle it. She reached the storage area and noticed something unusual. Only half the expected inventory had arrived. The delivery manifest showed the missing shipment had been redirected earlier that afternoon. No explanation. No note. Emily folded the paperwork and slipped it back into its folder. Another small detail. Another quiet inconsistency. She began preparing additional warming blankets anyway. One orderly laughed as he passed. Planning for winter? Emily smiled politely. I like being prepared. You always do. He walked away without another thought. By 7:20 p.m., rain was falling harder. The windows trembled as gusts of wind swept across the ambulance bay. Inside the emergency department, monitors continued their steady rhythm. Beep. Pause. Beep. Families whispered in waiting areas. Phones rang. Printers hummed. Everything sounded normal. Yet Emily noticed something else. Security officers had walked through the emergency entrance 3 times in less than 15 minutes. Not running. Not alarmed. Just quietly checking exits. She approached one of them. Everything all right? The officer smiled politely. Probably just precaution. Probably. He hesitated. Police asked hospitals to stay alert. That's all we've been told. Emily thanked him. She asked no further questions. The uncertainty itself told her enough. Returning to the nurse's station, she quietly opened the hospital's emergency operations checklist. Most staff rarely touched it outside scheduled drills. Emily reviewed it from memory. Trauma overflow locations. Secondary triage routes. Backup oxygen supplies. Generator transfer procedures. She closed the binder within seconds. A nursing student looked surprised. You memorized all that? Emily slid the binder back onto the shelf. It helps when people are frightened. The student smiled awkwardly. I don't think I'll ever remember all those pages. You don't memorize pages, Emily replied softly. You memorize people. The student frowned, unsure what she meant. Emily was already walking away. Minutes later, she paused beside the ambulance entrance once more. The parking area seemed strangely empty. Too few ambulances. Too little movement. Then, in the distance, faint sirens. One, then another, then several more. They were still miles away. Most people inside the hospital never heard them. Emily did. She looked at the digital clock. 7:31 p.m. Without drawing attention to herself, she began opening additional treatment rooms that normally stayed closed during routine evenings. Fresh linens. For pumps. Portable monitors. Everything ready. Another nurse noticed. We don't have enough patients for all these rooms. Emily continued working. Not yet. The nurse laughed. You always expect the worst. Emily placed a trauma shears set neatly onto the bedside tray. I expect people to need us. The answer sounded simple, but something in her expression made the nurse stop smiling. Outside, the growing chorus of sirens became impossible to ignore. The first ambulance turned into the hospital entrance far faster than normal. Then another appeared behind it. Then another. The flashing lights reflected across the rain-soaked pavement like waves of blue and red. Inside the emergency department, conversations slowly faded. Everyone looked toward the ambulance bay. Emily had already put on a fresh pair of gloves. She took one slow breath. Then another. Her heartbeat remained steady. Whatever was coming had finally arrived. The first ambulance had not even come to a complete stop when its rear doors flew open. 2 paramedics jumped out, pushing a stretcher covered in blood-soaked blankets. Multiple trauma, one of them shouted. Male, mid-30s, severe chest injuries, unstable blood pressure. The quiet rhythm of the emergency department disappeared in an instant. Doctors rushed toward the trauma bay. Nurses cleared hallways. Monitors were switched on before stretchers crossed the doors. Emily was already moving. She met the incoming team halfway, one hand steadying the stretcher while the other checked the oxygen line. Trauma Bay 1 is ready, she said calmly. No one questioned how she already knew. The patient disappeared behind swinging doors. Before they closed, another ambulance pulled into the bay. Then another. Then another. Within 3 minutes, 6 emergency vehicles were lined up outside. Their flashing lights painted the rain-covered pavement in alternating waves of blue and red. The charge nurse stared through the glass entrance. What is happening? A dispatcher finally broke through on the emergency radio. Attention all receiving hospitals. Major transportation incident confirmed. Multiple passenger buses and several civilian vehicles involved following a chain collision on the eastern bypass. Casualty numbers are still unknown. Expect continuous patient arrivals. The room fell silent for half a second. Then everyone moved at once. Doctors began calling for additional operating rooms. Respiratory therapists wheeled ventilators into the trauma area. Laboratory staff rushed extra blood samples toward processing. Phones began ringing faster than anyone could answer them. Emily stepped to the whiteboard near the nurse's station. Without waiting for instructions, she updated room assignments with quick, precise handwriting. Trauma 1, Trauma 2, Trauma 3, Pediatric overflow, Observation conversion. Every available space suddenly had a purpose. One junior nurse looked confused. We're filling observation? Emily nodded. It won't stay empty. Almost on cue, another ambulance backed toward the entrance. The waiting room doors opened. Police officers escorted several walking wounded inside. Some held towels against bleeding arms. Others limped with support from strangers. A teenage girl sat down quietly against the wall, her face pale with shock despite having almost no visible injuries. Emily crossed the room. She knelt beside her. Can you tell me your name? The girl whispered it. Emily checked her pulse. Fast. Skin cold. Eyes fixed on nothing. You're safe now. The girl never answered. Emily gently signaled another nurse. Possible hidden internal injuries. Bring her immediately. The nurse looked uncertain. But she isn't bleeding. Emily met her eyes. Not all dangerous injuries are visible. Seconds later, the teenager lost consciousness. The nearby nurse froze. Emily caught her before she struck the floor. Move now. Within moments, the patient was on a stretcher headed toward imaging. The nurse looked back at Emily, shaken. How did you know? Emily simply adjusted the girl's oxygen mask. She told us. The nurse frowned. She never said anything. Emily continued walking. Her body did. Inside Trauma Bay 2, voices began overlapping. I need blood. Pressure is dropping. Where is radiology? We're losing the airway. The noise grew louder. Everyone seemed to be speaking at once. Emily stood just inside the doorway for 2 seconds. She watched. Not the injuries. The people. One resident physician reached for equipment that had been moved. Another searched for medication already prepared beside him. 2 nurses nearly collided while carrying identical supplies. Nobody was doing anything wrong, but they were beginning to work against each other. Emily quietly shifted one equipment cart 2 feet to the left. She redirected another nurse through a different doorway. She handed an airway kit to the physician before he asked. The room immediately became smoother. Not quieter, just more efficient. Dr. Harris finally noticed. He looked around the trauma bay. Who reorganized this room? Nobody answered. No one had seen her do it. More ambulances continued arriving. Hospital security opened additional entrances. Stretchers lined the hallways. Family members began arriving faster than reception staff could process them. Some searched desperately for loved ones. Others stood silently, staring at the growing number of emergency vehicles outside. The hospital's public address system echoed overhead. Mass casualty protocol now in effect. Every conversation stopped. The announcement changed everything. This was no longer a difficult evening. The hospital had officially entered disaster operations. Emily walked quickly toward the central storage room. She unlocked emergency supply cabinets normally sealed during routine operations. An orderly watched her. Did someone authorize that? Emily handed him boxes of 4 fluids. They will. He hesitated. Shouldn't we wait? She looked at the crowded hallway behind him. People are already waiting. He nodded and hurried away without another question. At 8:04 p.m., the hospital's communications network began slowing under the growing volume of calls. Computer screens froze. Patient tracking updates lagged behind reality. Several departments began relying on handwritten notes instead. Frustration spread. Emily quietly collected clipboards and markers. She created temporary patient tracking sheets by hand. Simple, clear, visible, nothing complicated. Within minutes, nurses began using them without being told. The information started flowing again. Dr. Harris noticed the handwritten boards. He looked toward Emily. When did you set this up? She finished writing another patient's room assignment. A few minutes ago. He studied the board. It was organized better than the computer system currently failing around them. For the first time that evening, he looked at her with genuine curiosity. A paramedic rushed through the ambulance entrance. His uniform was soaked from the rain. He scanned the emergency department before finding Emily. There are still more coming, he said, breathing heavily. How many? He shook his head. We've lost count. For the first time all night, Emily closed her eyes for a single second. Not from fear, from calculation. When she opened them again, her voice remained calm. "Tell dispatch we'll keep receiving." The paramedic stared at her. She had spoken with absolute certainty, as though she already understood the weight of what was ahead. The overhead announcement repeated every 30 seconds. Mass casualty protocol remains active. All available emergency personnel report to assigned stations. No one needed another reminder. The emergency department had become a maze of moving stretchers, portable monitors, and exhausted medical staff. Every treatment room was occupied. Hallways had become temporary care areas. The waiting room had been converted into an additional triage space. Outside, rain continued to fall. Inside, time seemed to move faster. Emily stepped into Trauma Bay 3. A young resident was attempting to stabilize a patient with multiple fractures while another nurse searched for medication. "Has radiology called?" the resident asked. "No." "What about blood?" "Still waiting." The patient's blood pressure continued to fall. Emily looked at the monitor, then at the patient, then at the resident. Without raising her voice, she said, "Move him to operating room 2. Waiting another 5 minutes here won't change the outcome." The resident looked uncertain. "We haven't received confirmation." Emily remained calm. "If we wait for confirmation, we'll lose the window." For a moment, the room became silent. Dr. Harris entered just as the discussion reached its peak. "What's happening?" The resident answered first. "Emily thinks we should move him now." Dr. Harris glanced at the patient's chart, then at the monitor. Finally, he looked at Emily. "You've seen something?" She nodded once. "The bleeding isn't slowing." He studied the patient for another few seconds. "Move him." Within moments, the surgical team took over. Later, they would learn the patient had suffered a hidden arterial injury. Another few minutes in the emergency department could have been fatal. Emily never mentioned it again. Across the hallway, another problem was developing. Supplies were beginning to disappear faster than central storage could replace them. Nurses crossed the department repeatedly, searching for 4 pumps, trauma dressings, and airway equipment. Each trip stole valuable minutes. Emily watched the pattern for less than a minute. Then she quietly moved 3 mobile supply carts into the center of the trauma corridor. She grouped airway equipment together. For supplies together. Hemorrhage control kits together. Nothing complicated. Simply organized where everyone could reach them. Within minutes, staff naturally adjusted their movements. The constant back and forth slowed. Nobody announced the change. Nobody ordered it. It simply worked. The charge nurse noticed. "Who moved the carts?" An orderly pointed toward Emily. "I think she did." The charge nurse looked across the hallway. "Leave them there." More patients arrived. A middle-aged woman with severe burns. A construction worker with a collapsed lung. 2 children suffering from smoke inhalation after being trapped inside one of the damaged buses. Every room filled immediately. The noise became relentless. Monitors, voices, sirens outside, helicopters overhead. Yet Emily's movements never became rushed. She spoke quietly, walked steadily, listened before acting. Her calmness began affecting everyone around her. One nervous nursing student accidentally dropped a tray of sterile instruments. Metal clattered across the floor. The student's face turned pale. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." Emily knelt beside her. "It's all right. I ruined everything." "No." Emily began collecting the untouched instruments. "You made a mistake." The student's hands were shaking. "I shouldn't be here." Emily looked directly at her. "Then help me clean this up." The student took a slow breath. Within seconds, both of them were working again. The panic disappeared. At 8:36 p.m., another ambulance crew entered the department. Their uniforms were covered with mud and rain. One paramedic approached the nurse's station. "We've still got casualties waiting outside." The charge nurse frowned. "There aren't any open beds." Emily stepped forward. "How many can still walk?" "About 12. Move them to conference room B." The paramedic hesitated. "That's not a treatment area." "It is now." The charge nurse looked surprised. "We've never used it." Emily calmly replied. "It has lighting, electrical outlets, oxygen access, and enough space for secondary assessment." For a second, nobody moved. Then Dr. Harris spoke. "Do it." Within minutes, staff converted the conference room into a temporary treatment area. It relieved enough pressure to reopen 3 emergency bays. The flow of patients improved almost immediately. Dr. Harris found Emily a few minutes later while she was adjusting and for pump. You've done this before. She kept her attention on the patient. I've worked difficult nights. No. He shook his head. I mean something bigger. Emily remained silent. He studied her expression. You don't look surprised by any of this. She finished securing the 4-line before answering. People don't need surprise tonight. They need decisions. Before he could respond, another trauma call interrupted them. Emily was already walking away. Near the ambulance entrance, hospital security officers opened the doors for another arriving medical convoy. This time, the vehicles were different. Not civilian ambulances. Dark government emergency response trucks rolled quietly into the parking area behind them. Their markings were unfamiliar to most hospital staff. Several uniformed personnel stepped out, carrying sealed equipment cases instead of stretchers. They moved with calm discipline, scanning the emergency department before speaking to anyone. One of the officers paused. His eyes found Emily across the crowded hallway. For a brief moment, neither of them spoke. He gave the smallest nod, almost invisible. Emily returned the gesture just as subtly. Then she turned back to her patient as if nothing had happened. No one nearby noticed. But the officer did not continue toward hospital administration. Instead, he quietly changed direction and began walking toward the nurse everyone still believed was just another member of the emergency staff. The emergency department remained under relentless pressure. Stretchers lined every available hallway. Doctors moved from one critical patient to the next without stopping. Nurses spoke in short, clear sentences, conserving every second. The sound of helicopters overhead blended with the constant rhythm of ambulance sirens outside. Emily Carter checked the oxygen flow on a young patient's ventilator before moving to the next bed. She had not stopped working for nearly 2 hours. She had not complained once. The doors near the ambulance entrance opened again. 3 uniformed personnel entered with the hospital's emergency coordinator. Unlike the previous responders, these men did not rush. They observed first. Each carried a small communications headset. Their uniforms bore the insignia of a federal emergency medical response unit assigned to support large-scale disasters. Hospital staff assumed they were looking for the chief administrator. Instead, the senior officer slowly scanned the crowded department. His eyes stopped on Emily. Without hesitation, he walked directly toward her. Several nearby nurses looked up, expecting him to ask for directions. He stopped a respectful distance away. Nurse Carter. Emily looked up from the patient she was treating. Captain Lewis. It was the first time anyone in the hospital had heard her address a uniformed officer by rank. Lewis spoke quietly. Current assessment. Emily didn't answer immediately. She finished securing the patient's airway tubing before removing her gloves. Only then did she respond. Emergency rooms are operating above safe capacity. Surgical teams are holding, not failing. Supplies remain stable for approximately another hour if consumption continues at this pace. Communications are slowing, but manual tracking is working. She spoke without consulting a single document. Every number came from memory. Captain Lewis listened without interrupting. When she finished, he gave a single nod. Matches what we're seeing. The conversation lasted less than 30 seconds. Then he thanked her and stepped away. Several nearby staff members stared in confusion. Dr. Harris approached almost immediately. You know him? Emily picked up another medication tray. We've worked together. When? A long time ago. Before he could ask another question, she was already helping another patient. The answer satisfied no one. Across the department, the federal response team began unloading additional medical supplies. Instead of distributing them themselves, Captain Lewis stopped beside his team. Follow Nurse Carter's allocation. One of the younger officers glanced toward Emily. Directly? Yes. Without another question, they obeyed. A surgical resident witnessed the exchange. He frowned. Why are they taking instructions from one of our nurses? No one had an answer. Minutes later, another complication emerged. The hospital's blood bank reported that O-negative units were running critically low. A debate immediately began. Several physicians argued over which patients should receive the remaining supply. Voices grew louder. Time slipped away. Emily quietly stepped between them. Separate confirmed massive hemorrhage from precautionary requests. The room became silent. She continued calmly. Recheck every order placed in the last 20 minutes. Some patients have already stabilized. One physician looked frustrated. That will take too long. Emily met his eyes. It will take less time than giving blood to someone who no longer needs emergency priority. Dr. Harris looked around the room. Do it. Within minutes, duplicate requests and unnecessary emergency reservations were canceled. Enough blood became available to treat 3 patients whose lives depended on immediate transfusion. Nobody celebrated. They simply continued working. As midnight approached, exhaustion settled over the department. A young nurse leaned against the wall for a moment, fighting back tears. I can't keep up. Emily handed her a bottle of water. You already are. I've made mistakes all night. So has everyone. The nurse looked down. What if someone dies because of me? Emily answered after a brief silence. They won't survive because we're perfect. She tightened the nurse's loose protective gown. They survive because we don't stop. The nurse took a slow breath, then returned to work. Captain Lewis approached Emily again. This time his voice was even lower. The Regional Command Center wants an update. Emily glanced across the department. Patients continued arriving. Operating rooms remained occupied. Families waited behind temporary barriers. She spoke quietly. The hospital will hold. Lewis studied her face. You're certain? No. She looked back toward the trauma bays. But panic will collapse it faster than casualties. Lewis nodded slowly. I'll report that. Again, he accepted her judgment without hesitation. Dr. Harris had watched the exchange from across the hallway. The questions that had been building all night became impossible to ignore. He walked toward Captain Lewis. Excuse me. Lewis turned. I'm Dr. Harris. I know. Harris hesitated. Who exactly is Nurse Carter? Lewis looked across the emergency department. Emily was comforting an elderly patient while adjusting an infusion pump. She looked exactly like every other nurse on duty. After several seconds, Lewis answered carefully. Tonight, he said quietly. She's exactly who your hospital needs. Nothing more. He turned and walked away before another question could be asked. Dr. Harris remained standing in the hallway, watching Emily move calmly from one patient to the next. For the first time since the disaster began, he stopped seeing her as the quiet nurse who always worked without recognition. He began seeing someone who carried herself with the confidence of a person who had stood in crises like this before. Someone trained for moments when everyone else looked for certainty. Someone whose past remained hidden, but could not stay hidden much longer. The clock above the nurse's station read 12:18 a.m. More than 5 hours had passed since the first ambulances arrived. The pace had not slowed. It had simply changed. The patients now filling the emergency department were the ones whose conditions could change without warning. Some had survived surgery and needed constant monitoring. Others were still waiting for operating rooms. Every decision carried weight. Fatigue settled over the hospital like another layer of pressure. Doctors rubbed tired eyes before reading another chart. Nurses leaned against counters for only a second before returning to work. Empty coffee cups sat beside computer terminals that no one had time to use. Emily had not taken a break. She quietly checked each treatment area, saying little, noticing everything. A respiratory therapist hurried toward her. We're down to 2 portable ventilators. Emily nodded. How many patients still require transport support? 5. She thought for only a moment. Move the 2 most stable patients onto wall units. Free the portable ventilators for incoming transfers. The therapist blinked. I didn't think of that. You were thinking about the equipment, Emily replied. Think about the patients first. Within minutes, 2 ventilators became available without compromising anyone's care. Across the department, a disagreement erupted. A surgical resident wanted to move a seriously injured patient immediately. An anesthesiologist insisted the patient was too unstable. Their voices grew louder. Other staff began looking toward them instead of their own patients. Emily stepped between them. She didn't raise her voice. Tell me what you both need. The resident answered first. He needs surgery now. The anesthesiologist shook his head. He won't survive the transfer. Emily listened without interrupting. Then she looked at the patient's monitor. Blood pressure had improved slightly during the argument. She turned to the resident. Give anesthesia 5 more minutes to stabilize him. Then to the anesthesiologist. You get exactly 5. Neither argued. The shouting stopped. 5 minutes later, the patient left for surgery in far better condition. No one mentioned the argument again. Near the waiting area, another challenge appeared. Family members had been waiting for hours with almost no information. Fear was turning into frustration. One man demanded answers from the reception desk. Another insisted on entering restricted treatment areas. Security officers tried to calm them, but emotions continued rising. Emily walked over. She faced the families, not the security officers. "I know you're frightened," she said quietly. "I'm going to give you as much information as I safely can." Her voice was calm. No promises. No false reassurance. She explained why patient identification was taking time, why surgeries could not be interrupted, and why updates had to be verified before families were notified. The hallway slowly became quiet. People were still worried, but now they understood. One elderly woman gently touched Emily's arm. "Thank you for telling us the truth." Emily gave a small nod before returning to the emergency department. As she walked back, Captain Lewis intercepted her. "The regional command wants to establish an external medical coordination point." Emily looked toward the ambulance entrance. "Use the west loading dock." Lewis frowned. "It's smaller. It keeps incoming ambulances clear." He considered the suggestion for a second, then spoke into his radio. "We're moving coordination to the west dock." No discussion. No committee. Just trust. Dr. Harris watched the exchange from across the hallway. He no longer wondered whether Emily had unusual experience. Now he wondered how much authority she had once carried. Just after 1 a.m., another ambulance arrived. Inside was a firefighter who had been injured while helping survivors from the wreckage. He was conscious but losing blood rapidly. As the trauma team worked around him, the firefighter grabbed Emily's wrist. "How many did we save?" Emily looked at him for a moment. "You brought people here alive." He closed his eyes. "Good." He released her hand. Emily adjusted his blanket before stepping aside so the surgeons could continue. She never told him how many lives his crew had already helped save. He didn't need the number. The hours continued to blur together. The emergency department was no longer running on energy. It was running on discipline. Emily finally paused near a window overlooking the ambulance bay. Rain had almost stopped. The line of emergency vehicles was shorter now. For the first time that night, she allowed herself a slow breath. Captain Lewis walked beside her. "You've been on your feet for 6 hours. I'm aware. You should rest." She shook her head. "Not yet." He studied her carefully. "You always did this." Emily looked out at the quieting storm. "I learned a long time ago that leaders don't choose when crises begin." She paused. "And they rarely choose when they end." Lewis understood exactly what she meant. He nodded once and walked away without another word. Emily turned back toward the trauma base. There were still patients waiting, still families hoping, still staff depending on one another. The worst of the night might finally be passing. But before dawn arrived, one final challenge would test every decision made since the first ambulance crossed the hospital doors. By 2:07 a.m., the pace inside the emergency department had slowed just enough for people to notice how exhausted they were. The flood of new casualties had almost stopped. The difficult work remained. Patients who had survived the first hours now required constant attention. Surgeons continued operating upstairs. Intensive care beds were nearly full. Every transfer had to be carefully timed. Emily Carter checked another chart before walking toward the temporary treatment area in Conference Room B. Almost every chair was occupied. Some patients slept. Others simply stared at the floor, trying to understand how their ordinary day had become a night inside a hospital. A hospital administrator hurried into the emergency department carrying a tablet. His suit was wrinkled from hours of running between departments. "We have a problem," he said. "The media is outside. They want statements. Families are demanding updates, and regional officials are asking who's directing medical operations." Several people looked toward Dr. Harris. Before he could answer, the administrator continued. "Somebody has been making decisions across departments without appearing on the command roster." His eyes settled on Emily. "Were those decisions yours?" The department grew quiet. Emily looked at him calmly. "They were patient care decisions." "Did you have authorization?" Before she could answer, Captain Lewis stepped forward. "They were appropriate." The administrator frowned. "That wasn't my question." Emily spoke before Lewis could continue. "The responsibility is mine." Lewis turned toward her. "You don't have to." She gave the smallest shake of her head. He understood immediately. She was protecting the chain of command inside the hospital. The last thing the staff needed was confusion over titles or authority while patients still needed treatment. The administrator sighed. "Fine. We'll review everything after the incident." Emily simply nodded. No argument. No explanation. As soon as he walked away, she returned to checking a patient's foreline. Dr. Harris watched the exchange with growing disbelief. Most people would have defended themselves. Emily had accepted the scrutiny without hesitation, not because she believed she was wrong, because the discussion itself was a distraction. Minutes later, alarms sounded from the pediatric observation area. A young boy who had suffered chest injuries suddenly struggled to breathe. The nearest physician was occupied with another emergency. Emily reached the bedside first. She assessed the child in seconds. "Needle decompression kit," she said calmly. A nurse handed it over. Dr. Harris arrived just as Emily completed her assessment. "What do you have?" "Likely tension pneumothorax." He examined the child, then looked back at her. "I agree." Within moments, the pressure was relieved, and the boy's breathing began to improve. His frightened mother burst into tears of relief. Emily stepped back immediately, allowing the physicians to continue treatment. She never stayed where gratitude might find her. Captain Lewis received another radio call. After listening for several seconds, he walked toward Emily. "The regional director is on his way." She continued updating patient notes. "All right. He specifically asked for you." Emily closed the chart. "I'm busy." Lewis almost smiled. "I already told him that." An hour later, the emergency department looked different. The hallways were still crowded, but the panic had faded. Staff members worked together without being asked. The temporary systems Emily had introduced earlier in the night had become the hospital's routine. No one questioned them anymore. They simply worked. Dr. Harris approached her while she restocked a medication cart. "I owe you an apology." Emily looked up. "For what?" "I thought you were just quiet." She gave a faint smile. "I am quiet." "No." He shook his head. "I confused quiet with ordinary." Emily returned another package of sterile dressings to the shelf. "Happens more often than you think." Before he could say anything else, another patient called for assistance. She walked away without waiting to hear his response. Near dawn, Captain Lewis stood beside the ambulance entrance, watching the first hint of morning appear beyond the clouds. The regional director's vehicle pulled into the hospital parking area. Senior officials stepped out. Hospital executives hurried to meet them. Captain Lewis looked through the glass doors toward Emily. She was helping an elderly patient sit up in bed, completely unaware that several high-ranking officials had come looking for her. Or perhaps she knew, and simply didn't care. Within the next hour, the truth about Nurse Emily Carter would finally reach the people who had underestimated her since the beginning of the night. Not because she wanted recognition, but because the crisis was almost over, and there was no longer any reason to keep her past hidden. The first light of dawn filtered through the rain-streaked windows of the emergency department. The storm outside had passed. Inside, another storm was finally beginning to settle. The ambulance bay, crowded only hours earlier, now held a single arriving unit. The stream of casualties had slowed to isolated cases. Operating rooms remained busy, but the desperate rush that had defined the night was fading. For the first time since the disaster began, people could hear something other than alarms. They could hear each other. Emily reviewed the handwritten patient tracking board one final time. Every name had a destination. Emergency surgery, intensive care, observation, transfer. No one remained unaccounted for. She uncapped a marker and quietly drew a line beneath the final patient entry. The board that had replaced the failing computer system had carried the department through its hardest hours. A young nurse looked at it with relief. "I think that's everyone." Emily nodded. "I think so too." The hospital administrator entered with several regional officials. Captain Lewis walked beside them. Dr. Harris straightened his posture, expecting a formal review of the night's response. Instead, one official spoke first. "We've examined the operational reports." He looked around the exhausted emergency staff. The patient flow, temporary triage expansion, manual tracking system, and resource allocation prevented this department from becoming overwhelmed. Several staff members exchanged confused glances. Most assumed the praise was directed at hospital leadership. The official turned toward Emily. "Nurse Carter." She looked up from a medication cart. "Yes, sir." "Thank you." Nothing more. No speech. No ceremony. Just two simple words. Emily inclined her head politely. "You're welcome." Then she returned to checking medication labels. The officials stood silently for a moment before moving on to inspect other departments. The staff watched in disbelief. Dr. Harris finally walked over. "They thanked you." Emily continued her work. They thanked all of us. They said your plans kept the department running. She closed the medication drawer. No plan works without people willing to carry it out. He smiled faintly. You really don't like attention. Emily answered honestly. Attention doesn't treat patients. Captain Lewis approached before leaving the hospital. The regional director wanted to offer you a position. Emily already knew what he meant. I'm not coming back. I thought you might say that. He extended his hand. She shook it once. You never lost it, he said quietly. Emily looked around the emergency department. The nurses were laughing softly for the first time all night. A child was sleeping peacefully in his mother's arms. Order had returned. It was never about keeping it, she replied. It was about knowing when to use it. Lewis nodded. Without another word, he walked toward the exit. By mid-morning, the emergency department had returned to something close to normal. Fresh staff arrived for the day shift. Night shift nurses completed handovers. Maintenance workers removed temporary equipment from the hallways. The handwritten tracking board was carefully taken down. Its job was finished. A nursing student found Emily quietly restocking supplies. I heard everyone saying you saved the department. Emily placed a fresh package of bandages onto the shelf. No. She smiled gently. We all carried the night together. The student looked at her for a moment before nodding. For the first time, she understood that real leadership did not always stand at the front of the room. Sometimes it worked quietly beside everyone else. Emily removed her gloves, picked up another patient chart, and walked toward the next room. The disaster was over. Her shift, however, was not. She still had patients waiting. The emergency department was almost unrecognizable from the chaos of the night before. The temporary treatment area had been dismantled. Hallway stretchers were gone. Computers were back online, replacing the handwritten tracking boards that had carried the hospital through its busiest hours. Staff members finally had time to breathe. Dr. Harris sat in the small conference room reviewing the incident report when the hospital administrator entered with a sealed personnel folder. I thought you should see this, he said, placing it on the table. Inside was a brief summary provided by the Regional Emergency Command. It confirmed only what was necessary. Before becoming an emergency nurse, Emily Carter had served as a senior medical operations officer with a classified military trauma response unit. Her assignments had focused on coordinating medical teams during large-scale disasters and mass casualty incidents. Much of her service record remained restricted, but one detail stood out clearly. She had helped design emergency response procedures that were still being taught to civilian hospitals. Dr. Harris slowly closed the folder. So that's why. The administrator nodded. She never mentioned any of it. Across the emergency department, Emily was helping a patient prepare for discharge. Nothing about her suggested someone with years of elite operational experience. She spoke gently, adjusted the patient's bandage one last time, and wished him a safe recovery. When she returned to the nurse's station, Dr. Harris was waiting. I read your file. Emily looked at him for a moment. Then you know enough. You could have taken command the moment this started. She gave a small smile. It wasn't my hospital to command. It became your responsibility anyway. Emily shook her head. It became everyone's responsibility. Before he could respond, another call light illuminated above room 8. Emily picked up a fresh pair of gloves. Excuse me. She walked away to answer another patient. Dr. Harris watched her disappear down the hallway. The most experienced person in the building had never asked for authority. She had simply carried it, quietly, professionally, and only for as long as the people around her needed it. 3 days later, the emergency department had returned to its familiar rhythm. Monitors beeped steadily. Ambulances arrived one at a time. Families waited with the same quiet hope they always had. Emily Carter walked through the trauma bays before her shift, checking oxygen cylinders, testing suction units, and straightening supply carts. Exactly as she had done before the disaster. A newly hired nurse watched her work. I heard what happened the other night. Emily smiled politely. You heard about a busy shift. The young nurse hesitated. They said you were the reason everything held together. Emily clipped her identification badge to her pocket. No, she said softly. A hospital stands because everyone does their part. Before the conversation could continue, another ambulance arrived. Emily picked up a pair of gloves and walked toward the entrance with the same calm, steady pace. To the people passing through those doors, she was simply another emergency nurse beginning another ordinary day. And that was exactly how she wanted it to remain. The end.